You're listening to This Week in Cardiology from theheart.org on Medscape.
You can now access the latest in medical news on your Amazon Alexa-enabled device. Join me, Perry Wilson, every weekday morning for Medscape Medical Minute, where I highlight the top medical stories of the day. To add Medscape Medical Minute to your flash briefing, search for Medscape Medical Minute on Amazon and click Enable. Or open the Amazon Alexa app, go to Skills, search for Medscape Medical Minute, and click Enable. Then say, Alexa, what's the news? Or Alexa, what's my flash briefing? I hope you'll join us.
Hi everyone, this is John Mandrola from the Heart.org Medscape Cardiology, and this is This Week in Cardiology for June 11th, 2021. This week, COVID-Vaccine-Myocarditis, stroke and AFib, semaglutide, and iPhones and cardiac devices. First up, I had a great vacation. Stacy and I backpacked over 100 miles on the Appalachian Trail in western North Carolina and Virginia. I met up with a bear, slept with a few mice, and observed a distinctly curious form of human being called a thru hiker. Yes, people actually walk the entire 2,100-mile trail from Georgia to Maine. I made many memories. Now, first up, COVID. Obviously, the tide has turned in the last few weeks with plummeting cases and deaths. There were almost no masks seen in North Carolina and Virginia. And on TV, over the holiday, I saw a Stanley Cup hockey game that had a huge indoor crowd, as if there was no pandemic. The Indianapolis 500 welcomed 135,000 fans on Memorial Day weekend. Normalcy is around the corner, and this is great news, and surely due in large part to the COVID vaccines. But speaking of COVID vaccines, though, there is a cardiac issue to discuss. The journal Pediatrics has published a case series of 7 young males who developed symptomatic acute myocarditis following the Pfizer vaccine. I'll link to that publication. The thing I find most remarkable about reading these cases, and I'd encourage you to take a look at them as well, is that unlike many of the COVID myocarditis reports from 2020, which mostly stemmed from abnormal CMR scans, these pediatric cases had big elevations of troponins, CRPs, and abnormal CMR scans. Now, these kids surely had significant cardiac injury. The authors of the report stated that they were not making a causal relationship between the vaccine and the cardiac injury, but there have also been reports from other sources. For instance, the acting health commissioner in Connecticut announced at least 18 teens and young adults have shown symptoms of heart problems after receiving the vaccine. On June 1st, Science magazine published coverage of a report from Israel, and in that report, one of the doctors concluded, provocatively, that between 1 in 3,000 and 1 in 6,000 men ages 16 to 24 who received the vaccine developed myocarditis. The European Medicines Agencies has made note of this issue, and they've requested more information and will consider if any other regulatory action is needed. And yesterday, during a report to the FDA, Dr. Tom Shimabukuro of the CDC's Immunization Safety Office reported that the agency has received reports of at least 275 cases in the 16 to 24-year age group as of May 31st. This, he said, exceeded the number of myocarditis cases by a lot. Shimabukuro said, "We clearly have an imbalance there." Now, my comments on this situation are from the point of view of a neutral Martian who simply looks at the risk-benefit calculus and is not encumbered by the polarization and ideology surrounding COVID. If there is a causal link here, which seems highly likely given the circumstantial evidence from multiple sources, the probability that a young person gets myocarditis after vaccination is very, very low, ranging from as high as 1 in 3,000 to as low as 1 in 100,000. But here's the problem. In this age group, the risk of suffering severe COVID hospitalization, is also in that very, very low range. What's more, at this moment in time, the community prevalence of COVID is also super low. So therefore, to the neutral observer, the neutral Martian, the conclusion would be that we should spend a few more months collecting data on vaccine adverse effects in this age group before issuing emergency approval or making mandates. The calculus for young people in COVID vaccines is simply different than it is in older adults. Now, another weird thing about this situation is if you compare the extreme angst many experts displayed for the potential for myocarditis after COVID infection, a handful of flawed studies in 2020 almost stopped college sports. Recall that these purported cases of myocarditis were mostly just abnormal CMR scans in patients with mostly normal troponins and ECGs, and now we have a not tiny number of definite cases of cardiac injury amongst previously totally normal kids. And yet I'm not observing much concern out there in the media or social media. Why is this? It's peculiar. Now, I realize that CDC and WHO have to walk a tightrope, but it seems to me that being forthright and cautious about potential adverse effects of the vaccine in young people would surely increase, not decrease, public confidence in vaccine safety. And I'm just an electrophysiologist, but it appears to me that we have crushed COVID by simply vaccinating susceptible adults. Why not wait for more data before extending these novel therapies to young people? Next topic is AF detection after stroke. JAMA has published 2 randomized controlled trials looking at the detection of AFib after stroke. The first trial, called Stroke AF, asked the question of whether insertable cardiac monitors, ICMs, will detect more AFib in patients with a recent stroke attributed to a large vessel or small vessel disease. The Stroke AF trial excluded patients with cryptogenic stroke, known cardioembolic stroke, or AFib. About 500 patients with stroke are randomized to having an ICM or to standard care. The primary outcome was AFib greater than 30 seconds detected in the following year. Now, considering that patients in this trial were a mean age of 67 years and had a median CHA2DS2-VASc score of 5, the results are pretty predictable. 12% of the ICM group had AF detected versus 1.8% in the standard care arm. That's like 7.4 times hazard ratio for picking up AFib with the ICM. The supplemental figure E1 showed that most AFib was less than 6 hours in duration. 25% of AFib was 6 to 24 hours, and only less than 5% was greater than 24 hours. Most of these subclinical AFib episodes occurred after 30 days, and anticoagulation therapy was prescribed for 18 of 27, or 2/3 of patients in the ICM group. Now, the authors concluded that further research is needed to understand whether identifying AFib in these patients is of clinical importance. Notable was that Medtronic, the makers of the ICM, funded the study. Also, in the same issue of JAMA, the Canadian Per Diem RCT studied the use of ICMs versus 30-day ECG monitoring after an ischemic stroke. The primary outcome of Per Diem was greater than 2 minutes of AFib in the first year. About 300 patients with ischemic stroke were randomized to either the ICM or 30-day event recorder. And unlike stroke AF, about 2/3 of patients in Per Diem had had cryptogenic source. Per Diem reported similar results, about 15% of AFib detection in the ICM group versus 5% in the loop recorder group, and the risk ratio here was about 3.3x more likely to find AFib with the ICM. This led Per Diem investigators to make almost the same conclusion, quote, "Further research is needed to compare clinical outcomes associated with these monitoring strategies and relative cost effectiveness." Per Diem, Medtronic provided the ICMs for the study, but funding came from grant support. Now, my comments, starting from the obvious to the not so obvious. Clearly, the more you monitor older patients with high CHA2DS2-VASc scores, the more AFib you will detect. These 2 trials confirm the 2014 trials done after cryptogenic stroke, which also found more monitoring led to more AF detection. Now, second point, these studies may lead to more ICM sales, which are quite costly devices, not only in their initial cost, but also the cost of repeating downloads from them. But I'm not sure whether more ICMs will lead to fewer strokes. Both sets of authors of these trials strongly stated that the major weakness of these studies was that AFib is a surrogate and not a clinical outcome. And we need more research looking at how AFib detection bears on reducing future stroke. Consider the stroke AF cohort. Now, these are patients who presumably had ischemic stroke due to atherosclerotic disease in either a large or small cerebral vessel. Recall that patients who had strokes due to cardioembolic source were excluded. Now, patients who have cerebral atherosclerotic disease benefit from antiplatelets and statins. Okay, now you detect 6 minutes or 6 hours of AFib a few months later. What do? Do you add oral anticoagulation to the regimen of antiplatelet drugs? Now, this will surely reduce thrombotic risk, but will the increased bleeding from taking 2 clot-blocking drugs nullify the benefit? The editorials of these 2 trials note that most treating neurologists started oral anticoagulation when AFib was detected. And I totally get this when the stroke was clearly cardioembolic or even cryptogenic. But I think it's highly presumptuous when stroke was due to an atherosclerotic origin, say in a lacunar stroke. One of the major questions for modern cardiologists will be the threshold of AF burden that renders oral anticoagulation a net benefit. Now, answering this question will require more than just the data from the ICM. It also will require consideration of the unique characteristics of that patient. A patient with prior strokes or lacunar strokes is different than a person with embolic strokes or no strokes. Well, fortunately, there are 2 ongoing randomized controlled trials looking at DOAC use in patients who have device-detected subclinical AFib. Those will be very important trials. But in post-stroke patients, I think we need a heck of a lot more outcome trials. We already know we can pick up AFib. Now recall that the Navigate ESUS and Respect ESUS trials found that empiric DOAC therapy after an embolic stroke of unknown source did not reduce stroke versus aspirin. I see a lot of equipoise in the treatment of subclinical AFib. We've never had this much monitoring capability, so we don't know the quote-unquote normal baseline amount of AFib that older patients have. Now, examples of next post-stroke trials would be to compare an ICM-guided anticoagulation strategy versus a standard care, or perhaps we could do a trial randomizing post-stroke patients with low-burden AFib, say less than 6 to 12 hours, to either an oral anticoagulation or not. The editorialists also suggest considering left atrial health as a therapeutic strategy. And again, this could be studied in RCTs. You could enroll patients with left atrial disease based on echo and ECG parameters and then randomize those patients to oral anticoagulation versus not. Secondary prevention of stroke is a super common thing to see in the hospital. And rather than guessing, it would be so much better if we could just enroll more of these patients in clinical trials if there were the clinical trial infrastructure to do this. Next topic is obesity. This week, FDA approved a 2.4 milligram per week sub-Q dose of the glucagon-like peptide 1 GLP-1 receptor agonist semaglutide as an adjunct to reduce calorie diet and increase physical activity to treat adults who have obesity, BMI greater than 30, or overweight, BMI greater than 27, and these patients have at least one weight-related comorbidity. Now, given the high prevalence of obesity and its morbidity, this, I think, is very important news. The approval was based on the 4 phase 3 STEP trials, STEP, which I discussed on the February 26th podcast. In the STEP 1 trial, which was published in the New England Journal of Medicine, semaglutide induced a 15% weight loss versus 2.4% in the control arm. Now, the other STEP trials confirmed similar degrees of weight loss. Semaglutide seems to work by decreasing hunger, increasing the feeling of fullness, and thereby helping people reduce their caloric intake. In Step 1, GI symptoms such as nausea, diarrhea, vomiting, constipation were the most frequently reported events, and it occurred in more participants receiving the drug than receiving placebo. It was like 74% versus 48%. Adverse events that caused discontinuation of the drug were also greater in the semaglutide arm, 7.2 versus 2.8 per 100 patient years. So my comments on this, on the upside, this drug is already approved, albeit at a different dose, for glycemic control in type 2 diabetes, so doctors are used to it. A loss of 15% of body weight is clearly a statistically significant and clinically significant weight loss. I mean, since weight loss is so integral to AF management, I see electrophysiologists using this drug. The once weekly injection is kind of a nice feature. It may increase compliance just to take a shot on, say, Sunday afternoon or Sunday night. On the downside, the trials went on for a little more than a year, and obesity is a lifelong condition. Will the drug need to be continued, or once weight loss is established, will patients be able to come off the drug? And these are questions I wonder about. As outlined in journalist Marlene Busco's news coverage, cost is going to be a headwind. We don't know yet what pricing will be, but given the novel nature of these findings, I'd expect Novo Nordisk will make it quite expensive. Now, also fortunate is that there is an ongoing cardiovascular outcomes trial looking at semaglutide versus placebo in non-diabetic overweight or obese patients with cardiovascular disease. And also, there's an oral formulation of semaglutide, and Novo Nordisk will study that for weight loss as well. Next topic is iPhones and cardiac devices. Journal of the American Heart Association published a small study looking at the new iPhone 12's ability to interact with cardiac devices. Before I tell you about the study, let's make 3 background points. First, magnets interact with pacers and ICDs. A magnet placed over a pacemaker will induce asynchronous pacing, and a magnet placed over an ICD will disable tachycardia therapies. Second background point, newer Apple devices use magnets to enable wireless charging. Third background point, who hasn't fallen asleep and found their iPhone or iPad on their chest? Now, the iPhone 12 Pro Max has a MagSafe technology, and this can induce magnetic fields of over 50 Gauss, and that magnetic field is strong enough to activate magnet modes in cardiac devices. So this study had an in vivo component in which 3 patients with Medtronic, Abbott, and Boston Scientific devices presented for Gen Change had an iPhone 12 placed over their device, and the iPhone induced magnet reversion mode in all 3 cases. Now, in the ex vivo component of this study, the iPhone 12 was placed over 11 devices that were still in the package, and selected Medtronic and Abbott devices tested were indeed susceptible to the EMI. The Boston Scientific devices appeared to be less susceptible. Now, this data in this study is similar to a case report from the journal Heart Rhythm, in which authors showed that an iPhone 12 could indeed deactivate therapies in a Medtronic ICD. And also interesting is another Heart Rhythm report in which a Fitbit and Apple Watch wristband were able to deactivate a Medtronic ICD at 2 to 2.4 centimeters. Now, this issue of iPhones and cardiac device interaction makes the podcast because we will surely see more personal health devices, and Apple promises even stronger MagSafe batteries. Word has it that the iPads will soon have these stronger magnets. It seems wise to make sure that our device patients aren't sleeping with their iDevices. I also wonder whether device manufacturers might start making the magnet reversion switch a little less sensitive. Bottom line is we're going to have to be alert to this potential interaction. Now, a brief note for next week. Next week, I will cover the controversial meta-analysis on the treatment of stable coronary disease that was presented at the EuroPCR meeting and also published in the European Heart Journal. So that's it for this week. As always, I'm grateful that you listened. Thank you. And remember, friends, if you like this podcast, please remember to give us a rating, write us a review, or tell your friends about it so others can find us. Until next week, this is John Mandrola from theheart.org, Medscape Cardiology.
You're listening to This Week in Cardiology from theheart.org on Medscape.